Hello, Colin here again. In this class, we're going to look at password hashing and how it can be used to improve security. So often when we're reading about security breaches, there's a lot of talk about passwords and hashing, and we need to understand what's going on there. So we're going to start with the basics and look at the worst case scenario and then see how hashing can make things less bad. I don't want to say better, but less bad. So for various technical reasons and using various techniques, hackers may get access to the system. And when a hacker gets into a system, she may do a number of things. She might change something in the system. So, she might change the value associated with her current account in the bank. Or if she wants to be more discreet, she might change the number of frequent flyer miles she has and use those to get free flights. Or the hacker might copy data from the system. So very often hackers are poking around in the system looking for data. And that data is valuable in different ways. So some data is inherently useful and inherently valuable. So the hacker may be in there looking for private information, for example. She may be in looking for trade secrets or other forms of intellectual property. She may be looking for designs, plans, things like that. So some data that's broken into and stolen is inherently valuable, inherently useful. But a lot of data that's stolen is used then for other purposes. It's not the data itself is valuable, but the things that you can do with it. So private information, for example, even if it's not valuable information in its own right, could be used for blackmail, for example. So if someone is having an affair, that's a private thing. The fact that they're having an affair doesn't get you anything. But of course, if the individual is blackmailed, there's money to be made there. Email addresses on their own can actually be valuable. There have been documented cases where all people were after was a list of customers of a bank, for example, or of an investment house or a stockbroking firm, because if you have a list of people who are known investors, then maybe you can enlist them in your pump and dump stock scheme, for example. So, a bunch of emails where something about the people can be used, just to spam them even. Credit card information can be used for fraud, obviously. If the information contains people's names, addresses, and their credit card numbers and other information, then their credit cards could be used. And if there's a lot of information, their identities could even be assumed and you could commit other kinds of fraud. One kind of information that's especially useful are usernames and passwords. Now, when you break into a system and you have access to the usernames and passwords on that system, that's not a big deal. You've already broken in there. You're already there. But stolen lists of usernames and passwords are especially useful because people often use the same password on different systems. So if you know that Mike@hotmail.com, if you know that his password on this system is secret, well then, maybe other systems, other sites he subscribes to, other services he subscribes to, other sites he goes to, maybe he's used the same thing there. Similarly, if Zippy@Gmail's password is 8765431 here on this site that you've already broken into, but you might be able to use this then to break in somewhere else and do more damage elsewhere. So that's what makes stolen lists of usernames and passwords valuable. They might open other doors. So what can we do then to get around this? Okay, obviously we're all told, Don't use the same password, have a different password for every single site you go to and every single service you use. And like we're going to do that. We just don't. We have enough things now going on in our lives to be doing all that. So this is where hashing comes in. So hashing can obscure the passwords. So it makes it possible to check that the user has the correct password without actually storing a list of all the passwords. So that's the magic of it. That's what makes it clever, is you can tell that if what the person has put in is the correct password without ever actually having his password. So sometimes, for example, when someone says, "Oh, I need my password, I've forgotten my password, can you tell me what it is?" And the sysadmin might say, "Well, I don't know what your password is." And you say, "But you can get it from the system." You're like, "Well, no, I can't actually. We don't store your password." And then you're asking, "But sure, how do you know if I'm using the right password?" So if you don't store it, well, the magic of hashing. So a hash function is a one-way function, and that's important, that jumbles up a string into an arbitrary sequence. So by one way, it means you can't do an inverse of it. So something like division is a two-way function. You can divide by x and you can get back to what you started with by multiplying by x. You can do the inverse of the function. There's no way to do an inverse of a hash function. You can't work your way back. And so a hash function will take a string, say like the word apple, and then it outputs something totally arbitrary and jumbled up. It actually looks totally random, but the important thing is that every time you put apple into this function, you'll get out the same string of jumble. So it does so in a deterministic way. You can tell what it's going to do. It'll do the same thing every time. Every time you put in a word, if you put in the same word twice, you'll get the same hash out twice. It looks fairly random, and it is fair to say that if you look at the computer science mechanics underneath, a hash function and a random number generator that takes a seed, they do actually have a lot in common. And the big thing they need to do is to be as jumbled up and as arbitrary and as random as possible. So a well-designed hash function then, if there are small changes to the input, you'll get big changes to the output. So in a good hash function, a tiny change will result in a big difference in the output. So if apple is this arbitrary string here, something similar but different like apples is super different. You see? It's not a little bit different. So although apple and apples are a little bit different, the hash functions they produce are very different. And that's an important point. That's an important feature of a good hash function. So if we look here at Colin with one L and Colin with two L's, you'll see that they're totally different. Again, apple 1 and apple 1 with a lowercase a and uppercase a, completely different. So you see, you'd imagine, that they would be quite similar. But no, in a good hash function, they're completely different. Now, like I said, hash functions are one way. So you can go from apples to that gibberish. But if you have the gibberish, you can't go back and figure out what the original password that gave you that was. And that's an important feature. That's one of the things actually that makes it difficult to design your own hash function. That's an important feature of a good hash function, and that's actually not easily done. You'd need some fair computer science chomps there now to get that done. So, how does this help us then? Well, what we do then is, instead of storing the actual password that the user uses in the database, we just store the hash of that password. So we don't store the actual password at all. So if someone breaks into this database now, okay, unfortunately they've broken into our system. They're already in there. This particular ship has sailed. They also have the list of our users with their email addresses, and that's a loss. We're going to have to take that hit. But at least we're not giving them the passwords that those people used to log in to our system, and by extension that they might have used to log in elsewhere. So how does this work then? Well, let's suppose user luke@tatmail.com comes along, okay, and his password is I hate my dad. Okay? So we put this password that the user has entered through the hash function, the same hash function that we used to store the password the first time round. And then we compare the hash that's the result of this password with the hash that we got when we stored the password first time round. And so if the hashes match, well then the password that was entered is correct. So we can tell that the user has entered the correct password, but we don't have to store the password in order to know that. We can compare the hashes, and if the hashes match, then we're good to go. We're not going to look in detail at how you would design a good hash function, but obviously if many inputs could result in the same hash, then that's a bad hash function. If your hash was a number between 1 and 100, and that's all you got out of your hash function, well then, any random password would have a 1 in 100 chance of being correct. Now, if, however, the password that the user enters is not the original correct password, well then that will give a different hash. And so when we compare the hash that was generated from the input password with the hash that was generated by the password that we've stored, with the stored hash, if they're not the same, well then the correct password wasn't entered. So we know enough to say to the user, the password you entered was wrong, but we still don't even know what the password was. And that's what makes this so clever. Now, so it is impossible then, well, in computer science we don't like to say impossible, but it is very, very, very difficult to go back from the hash to the original password. But hacks and attacks are still possible. So you might say to yourself, well, what could a hacker with the username and the hashed password possibly do? I mean, if you take this hash and go to another website and try to log in with it, well, this hash will be hashed and give a whole load of different random characters as a result, and sure, that won't match the stored hash either. So the question you might ask, well, how useful are the hashes of people's passwords? Well, as it turns out, you can do some damage with those, all right. So the first thing you could do if you were a hacker and you have a list of usernames and hashes is you could try a brute force attack. So you might go, well, I'll see, is A the password? I'll put in A into the hash function, see what I get. Does that match any of the passwords in my list? Or does it match the person I'm trying to log in as? Then you might try B, hash B, see what you end up with. See, does that match anything? Hash C, see what that results in when I put it through the hash function. Is that any good? Then I'll try D. And you might eventually get to capital Y and capital Z. And then you go, okay, now I'm going to try AA. Is AA the password? And then is AB the password? And is AC the password? And eventually might get to ZY and ZZ. And then I might go AAA, AAB, AAC. And you could see how this would go on and on and on. Now, one important thing to realize is that this is all done offline. So the hacker has this information, in her basement or whatever. And she can do all this cracking without going near any of the websites. So if she believes that a particular user has an account at a particular stockbroking website and she wants to break in, she doesn't have to go to the website and try the password and fail and come back and try again and come back and try again. First of all, that's very time consuming. That adds a lot of that multiplies the time that would be required. But of course, also if you enter the password, say 5 or 6 times incorrectly, the user will be locked out. Okay, and some security measures and some defensive measures might be triggered. So you see, this scheme allows the hacker to try and break the passwords offline. So that can be done in the basement with some very fast computing power, or even some cloud-based computing power that was probably stolen from somebody else. So anyway, with this brute force attack, a hacker might eventually, having gone through all of the possible combinations, so like trying every possible combination on a padlock, might eventually discover that when you put APPLE into the hash function, you get this particular hash here. And, well, looky here, isn't that amazing? That's a match for one of the passwords that was in the list that I stole. So that can be done. Now, a brute force attack isn't very common because it's just so time consuming. It requires an awful lot of resources. Okay? Like, as the password length increases, the time required to crack it increases also. But importantly, it increases exponentially. And it can be frustrating at times if you're a scientist or an engineer when you realize that a lot of the muggles, a lot of lay people don't fully understand what exponentially means. I mean, it doesn't mean a lot. It's a multiplier. So, a password that is 16 characters long doesn't take twice as long as a password that's 8 characters long. Each time you add a new character, you're multiplying the amount of time that it takes to crack it using a brute force attack. You're not adding as much again. So if you go from 7 characters to 8 characters, you're not increasing it by 1/8, I want to say, or even 1/7. It's a multiplier. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why many systems insist on a minimum length of password. Because increasing the password even just by 1 or 2 more characters makes a brute force attack multiples more work than it would be with a short password. And so it becomes a numbers game, really. It's just a question of how much resource does a hacker want to expend on breaking this particular table of hashed passwords. Now, a brute force attack, so, is very expensive. And if the target was worth the effort, it might be the way to go. But typically, it's too expensive for low value targets. Like, I don't think any hacker would bother using a brute force attack to try and break into my email or something, because I'm just not important enough. A dictionary attack, on the other hand, is much more efficient. So if we assume that the words that people have used for passwords are actually words rather than just random sequences of characters, well, then we can reduce the number of things we would have to try. The hacker would reduce the number of possible passwords by an awful lot. It would only be a fraction. So if you take if you take, say, a sequence of 5 characters and consider all of the possible combinations that you could generate with 5 characters, the number of those that are actual 5-letter words that people use in English, for example, is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So you can confine your attack to real words. So in a dictionary attack, what the attacker does is she goes through a dictionary of words that could be passwords, hashes those, and see what the resulting hash comes out to be, and compares that hash then with the table of potential targets. And so if the password is in the dictionary, then the hack is going to be much more likely to be successful. So you could see here that the hacker might try aardvark, see what that turns out to be. No, that's not a match for what we want. Try abacus, no. Abattoir, no. Abbey, no. Abdicate, no. Appetizer, no. Applaud, no. Apple, woohoo, okay. I've now found the password that generates the hash that's in my table of targets. So you could see how this is vastly more efficient than trying every possible combination of characters. It's only a fraction of the effort that's required. Now, in reality, an attacker won't actually go through the English language dictionary in alphabetical order. At a minimum, they would use a dictionary where the most frequent words are used. So, you know, those weird Scrabble words that no one's ever heard of that are real words, they're probably not good passwords either. So the hacker would probably be wasting time on words like that, whereas if she were to use common passwords, she'd be much more successful. And so if the attacker was using a dictionary of real language words, she would use them in order of frequency, with the more obscure ones at the end. But actually what hackers often use are lists of passwords that have been stolen in plain text. So if a hacker breaks into a website and discovers thousands of email addresses and passwords in plain text that have not been hashed, well, obviously those passwords can be used to try getting in somewhere else. But also, if you have thousands and thousands of passwords that are the kinds of thing that people use, that's a really great basis for the hacker to use in a dictionary attack. And it often comes to pass that, you know, there's a security breach and one of these is released and you'll get articles, oh, who knew that, you know, such and such was the, you know, password du jour, that who knew that thousands and thousands of people were using this as their password. So if we look here at the list on the right, for example, you have obvious things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Picture 1, it seems, is a very common password, and we all know, of course, password is a very popular password. QWERTY, because people can just, you know, do one key after another. It seems I love you is fairly common. QWERTY IOP just means you keep going. ASDFG, again, that makes no sense till you look at your keyboard, an English language keyboard anyway. If it's a French one, you'll get something different. Princess is quite common. 1Q2W3E4R looks like a great password till you actually look at the keyboard again and you realize, okay, no. So the hacker then can use a dictionary of thousands and thousands of commonly used passwords, plug those into the hash function, and see if there's a match for someone in the database. And if it's a match for the hash function, for the hash of one of the targets, it's good to go. And so that's much more efficient than it would be to do brute force attack. It's also more efficient than it would be to do a alphabetical dictionary attack, because you're using passwords that people actually use. So picture 1 there, for example, wouldn't have appeared in an English language dictionary. Neither would ABC 123 have appeared in a dictionary, when in hindsight it's a handy enough bet, I would think, if you're a hacker. Furthermore, to save time, what hackers can do is that they can pre-calculate the hashes. So I could have a table of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the hashes for that, and even with various different hash functions. And another one then for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Calculate the hashes for that with the various different hash functions. Password, do the hashes for that with various different hash functions. And then I could compare the hashes that have been generated with the hashes in the database of targets. So you don't even have to do the hashing every time, because it's going to be the same every time. So instead of using the dictionary of commonly used passwords, you could just go straight to the dictionary of hashes of commonly used passwords. And of course, if you have a list of target hashes, and one of those is, if you search those for, say, the MD2 hash of the word password, and you see that that appears in there, well, then you've probably figured out what hash function is being used. So if that reminds you a bit of cracking the Enigma machine and stuff, there's similarities there. So what might we do to take it to the next level, to make it harder for the hackers? Well, because very small changes into the input into the hash function result in big changes in the output, of course, one of the things that sysadmins are always insisting we do is that we add some strange character or number. So increasingly now you're seeing a minimum password length, an insistence that there's an uppercase character, and an insistence that there's a number, and in some sites, an asterisk or an exclamation mark or something as well. And of course, adding any of those can frustrate a English language dictionary attack. And of course, changing things around just a little bit can help with that. Now, if you're doing this in such a way that it has ended up in one of the dictionaries of hacked plain text passwords, then you're still in trouble. So if I was in the habit of doing APP1E instead of Apple, and if I was super clever and the first person to ever think of that, and no one would ever have thought of that or considered to try that password in an attack, well, if I did that at a website that stored it in plain text and all that got stolen, well, then the jig is up. That password is now out there in a list of passwords that people use, and it could be tried then against some of the hashes in a table of targets. But fear not, we can do a bit more and make life even harder for the hackers. It might be tempting at this stage to think, well, if people are going to use a dictionary of stolen passwords and plug those into the standard hash functions and compare the results to the hashes that were stolen, maybe I should come up with my own hash function, a super secret hash function that no one knows about, and sure then, they'll never figure it out. And that's actually quite tempting, But it turns out it's a bad idea. If some guy somewhere sets out to make up his own password, make up his own hash function, it often doesn't end well, okay? Coming up with a good hash function is actually very, very difficult to do. It's very similar to coming up with a random number generator. You'd think there could be nothing as easy in the world as generating random numbers. And in computer science, it's one of the hardest problems, actually. Generating random numbers and good hash functions, very tricky. If you think you have a new hash function and you think it's a great idea, you would release it to the world and people might test it. And there's various protocols you can use to test it and see how good it is. And people might come back and say, actually, original, yeah, but, secure, not so much. So that's something to consider. Also, hash functions have other uses. So hashing passwords actually wasn't the first job they were given to do in computer science history. They had other jobs to do. And so not all passwords were designed or adapted to this particular job. So you have to be careful. So some very well-known hash functions are now considered great for doing some kinds of hashing in certain roles, but actually quite bad for passwords. So, a hash function, you see, you might want it to be efficient and fast and all these things. And at the same time, you might want it to be a good hash function. So that trade-off too can be a problem. So as a general rule, anyway, it's best to stick to the proven hash functions and don't get any notions about creating your own hash function, because there are many tales of woe that start with that and end badly. And we still have one or two things up our sleeves that even using the standard hash functions, we can make life more difficult for the hackers. So this brings us to salt. So adding salt to a password before it's hashed can make the password discovery more difficult. So salt is a random string of characters that's added to the password before it's hashed. So here we have a muggle who has chosen QWERTY as his password, despite being told not to do that and despite being told to use it only once ever in his life. He's continued to using this all across his different sites on the internet. So how do we protect this person from a dictionary attack using common passwords when we know that QWERTY is probably in the top 10? Well, this is where the salt comes in. So we take his QWERTY password and we add to it either at the beginning or at the end, or the beginning and the end, or even in the middle. There's all these different things we can do. We might even keep that technique, what we're choosing, a bit of a secret. But we take this random sequence of characters here. So we have the D exclamation mark H8 HF there. And we add that to the password. And then we hash this new longer password. And this gives us a very different hash. Now, this has a great advantage because it allows us to have the advantage of a really, really long, really unique and not in a dictionary password without the burden of the user having to actually remember it. So someone who goes around using QWERTY as a password can still have all of the benefits of a unique, really long password when it comes to attacking the system using the hash table of targets, the compromised hashes. And this is very significant because, of course, remember I was saying earlier, it's exponential. So like any increase you can do on the length of the password even, and you're increasing the effort and increasing the resources that would be required to crack the hashes. So when it comes to accessing the system then, QWERTY comes back, types in QWERTY as his password. We append the salt to the password that was entered, perform the hash on this new, longer password, and if it's a match for what's stored in the password table, then yip-de-doo, QWERTY was indeed the correct password. If the hash isn't a match for what we've stored against this particular user, well then the password that was entered wasn't correct. But importantly, without knowing what the salt was, the hacker can't actually combine the salt and the QWERTY together, or can't combine the salt and the words in the dictionary attack to try and figure out what the password was. So you could do a system like this and keep the salt secret. But actually we don't. In fact, what we do is we give each unique user, when we're creating the login credentials, a randomly generated unique salt. And we store that salt with the salted hashed password. Now you might say, if the hacker has the salt, well, then he can do loads, But no, actually, it doesn't work like that. Even with the salt, the computational effort is massive because, of course, everything would have to be rehashed. So you can't compare the hashed passwords with a table of pre-calculated hashes based on what was in the dictionary. So Zippy comes along here and enters his 876543321 as his password. We go and look up what the salt is for this user. And this was randomly generated when the account was created, or the last time the password was changed anyway. And so we then combine that with the user password. And then, as before, this new longer password gets sent to the hash function, and out the other side we get our hash. And if the hash matches, then yip-de-doo, the user is authenticated. And if the hash doesn't match, well then no. So this brings us then to the best practice for passwords. And now that we understand that hash tables are used in order to protect passwords, and we understand that the effort required to crack a password increases exponentially, it can start to make sense as to why there are so many requirements or minimum requirements for a password in a system. So of course, the best thing you could insist on is that we use a different password for every system. But like, we live in the real world. I personally couldn't handle one more password. No. We require a minimum length. And that's because the time required to crack a password is going to be some value n to the power of the length. Not multiplied by the length, to the power of the length. So as the length increases, the work required for a successful attack on the passwords goes up and up and up and up exponentially. But like I said, exponentially has a very, very specific meaning. Now, there's often a requirement then to add extra characters. So we don't want you to just have a word. We also want a number or some punctuation. And the reason we insist on that is that it can frustrate a dictionary attack. So if you have a dictionary of just words that are used in the English language, and you might even be very sophisticated in combining them and stuff, but most people just use one word, well, adding punctuation is going to frustrate that. But of course, that doesn't help if the password, which is the minimum length and even has those extra characters, has been the subject of an attack or an infiltration on a system that has it stored in plain text, which is very bad practice and should never happen. But if that has happened, then that particular password is now in a list of passwords. It's out there in the wild, and it's not a secret anymore. So the super cool, unique password that someone thought up, it's out there now. So then this brings in the salt. So when we add salt to a password before we do the hash, we get the benefits of the extra length. So we can, add 16 characters to the length of the password with no drama for the user. And we can also add those random characters as well, again, with no cost to the user. And that really makes it more difficult then for the hackers. And if we give a unique salt to each user, it adds again to the computation required for the hacker. And the important thing is that it's a numbers game. So if your email address and password hash is out there and you're important enough, someone might be prepared to expend the resources and the effort in order to crack that. But for most of us, we're not that important. What they could get from us just isn't really worth perhaps the computational effort, which ultimately is real money, that would be required in order to crack the hash of our passwords. Interestingly, of course, one of the reasons hackers would like to gain access to a system is that they can use then the computing power of that system to do things like crack passwords. Another thing they like to do is Bitcoin mining. But if you can get free computing power, as hackers like to do, well, then, of course, you can start cracking hash tables without having to pay. And so that's attractive. But really, it's a mathematical numbers game, and you want to make the complexity, the computation required, so great that it's just not practical. We don't ever want to say impossible. But, if it's going to take 5 years to figure something out with the current technology, then, that might be safe enough. Now, in 10 years, something that was uncrackable 5 years ago, maybe that's a whole other thing. Okay, so that's hash functions. And that's why when people talk about a breach, they talk about, first question is, was the password table hashed? And then they get into all these different questions about what hash function was used and, was there a salt? This is all the things they're talking about, because each of these things makes it less likely that this compromised system and this data breach can lead to other ones elsewhere, because it's accepted as a fact of life that people reuse their passwords. Great stuff. So guys, I hope that clears things up there.